Well, welcome to you both, and to everybody. Everybody awake and all throughout the day. Coffee was good. And how many of you saw the CNN YouTube debate last night? Anybody submit a question over YouTube through the camera? All right, it's a generational thing. We'll work on that. For those of you who haven't seen it, if you can, dial it up on YouTube or on your TiVos, I recommend it. It's really interesting because it showed a very innovative way of engaging people with their politicians and personalizing and humanizing the issues, or at least some of them. I've covered for too long politics and foreign policy news, and I can tell you, international affairs, how difficult it is and how challenging it is to try to take stories that repeat in one form or another day after day after day and keep them fresh and keep them engaging and keep them out before the public. This political cycle, it seems to me, is more important than ever, that this complicated issue of America's role in the world, how America engages the world and conducts its conversation with the world, be engaged by the candidates. Thanks. And it's harder, though, because while there are more candidates and more media, the stories don't fit a simple single prism as they did for the 40 years of the Cold War. We could go just about anywhere on the planet, and there were communists and non-communists, good guys and bad guys, and whether I was in Central America or I was in Africa, or whether I was trucking around after Lech Wałęsa through the shipyards of Gdansk, which I had the great fortune to do, there was that prism. Is the only prism we have now the prism of terrorism? Is the only prism we have now the prism of war? And if not, if we don't have a prism, how do we connect on these other complicated, complex issues? What is the American public looking to hear and see, and what do they expect from their candidates? So with that by way of introduction, a long-winded way of saying the stakes are really high. Michael, let me turn to you first and ask you, in your polling and in your sense of the electorate and the Democrats, how do they rank foreign policy, foreign affairs?
Well, the first thing is when you say foreign policy, foreign affairs, you think of one thing and one thing only, which is Iraq. And that takes up a lot of the debate right there. And preparing for this panel, I started thinking, well, I don't want to look at foreign policy beyond Iraq, and doing that in this context right now is sort of like talking about, as we used to say, Playboy without looking at the pictures. There's something there's some articles, but it's not really what you want to talk about. So every other issue, like building a safer, stronger, better, safer world, ends up being put in that context to some extent. And while all the candidates, you look at the websites for all the Democrats, I can say that all of them have lengthy pieces on foreign policy. And I think the big difference, going back to your PRISM question, from not just the Cold War, but post-Cold War. If you look at the post-Cold War era, then it wasn't a us-them prism, it was a, and Bill Clinton benefited from this in 1992, we don't want to talk about the rest of the world prism. It was basically taking care of problems at home versus taking care of problems overseas.
And people want to talk about those problems and overseas
now? Now, the only difference, I still think it's very hard. The candidates are all addressing it, but it's like you said, it's not clear. It used to be if you're either a free trader or protectionist. Now people are much more confused about that because they're all so interconnected. So I think there's a recognition by the public that they're interconnected, but I think there are increasing concerns. I'll just stop this with one point. You look at 2000 national polling showed people thinking that expanded foreign trade, or what some questions call free trade, was benefiting the country, got to be close to a high point, like 40% of the people saying we benefit from that. That number's gone steadily down, where now we are to the point where close to 40% are saying that expanded foreign trade is hurting them, and even more think it's hurting their children's lives. I think it's interesting. They're not even seeing it for the future necessarily being a positive. And this is at a time when I'm saying that everyone realizes we are so interconnected.
I want to go to Glenn quickly, and then our surrogates are here, our representatives are here. We'll have them come up, and then we'd like to ask you to come back a little bit later, and you can help us put a button on all this. But very quickly, difference between Democrats and Republicans on where foreign policy issues are rated in terms of priority issues for this campaign cycle?
I actually think that they're the same level, Iraq being first and we have our own pivot to try to show how strong we are. We have to show we're tougher, and Glenn can talk for the Republicans, but I think they have the same thing. Their pivot, though, is to say, well, it's screwed up, but not that badly.
I couldn't frame a question around it.
As is typical with foreign policy, it's not quite that simple as the soundbite Michael just gave.
But they still get to laugh, those sound bites.
The biggest difference is in our surveys, when we go through a list of issues, foreign policy as a concept is pretty low on that list. Iraq is very high, and what you see there is Democrats and independents rating that as the biggest issue that they're concerned about. Republicans, it's much lower on the list. What they define is they talk about national security and terrorism when they're thinking about foreign policy. So I think Michael made some good points about, look, it's not just one prism of how do we interact with other countries, what are our bilateral relationships, multilateral aid relationships, or anything like that. I think for the public it is Iraq on one level, national security and terrorism on another, and then as Michael touched on, you have foreign trade, protectionism, also there, outsourcing being a major campaign discussion, both on a micro level in House races and on a macro level in the presidential race. So I think it's multi-layered. If you ask the public, how important foreign policy is, they'll say, it's not that important. You start getting into these individual issues, and that's when they pay a lot more attention.
All right, Glenn and Michael, let's do this. Let's thank you now and have you rejoin us, and I'll turn it back over for introduction.
Well, that was a quick jump start. We'll have them come at the end and do a little wrap up with us. Now we have the great pleasure of welcoming some distinguished members of Congress and representatives of the presidential candidates from the Democratic side. Tony, you ready? Okay. Representing Senator Joe Biden, please welcome Tony Blinken. He's Majority Staff Director of the U.S. Senate Committee on Foreign Relations. He's here today in his capacity as a voluntary campaign worker for the Biden campaign. I need to make that very specific. Thank you. Next, representing Senator Hillary Clinton, please welcome Congressman Jim McGovern of Massachusetts. Mr. McGovern is serving his 6th term and is Vice Chairman of the House Rules Committee. Representing Senator Chris Dodd, please welcome Congressman Javier Becerra from California. Oh, he's on his way. Okay. All right, we'll welcome him when he arrives. Representing Senator John Edwards, please welcome Congressman Brad Miller of North Carolina, a 3rd-term congressman and member of the House Committee on Foreign Affairs. Representing Senator Barack Obama, please welcome Congressman Adam Smith of Washington State, a 6th-term member of the Committee on Foreign Affairs. And representing Governor Bill Richardson from his home state of New Mexico, please welcome 5-term House Appropriations Committee member, Congressman Tom Udall. Now it's my pleasure to turn the program over to Mr. Cesno.